The room was full of laughter when my uncle leaned back in his chair and said, "Amelia, at your age, you still can't even afford a house." My cousins laughed. Someone even tapped their coffee cup on the table like it was a punchline. I smiled calmly, looked around the conference room, and said, "Actually, I own the building you all live in." The laughter stopped instantly. The room went completely silent. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because this story gets much more unbelievable. For a moment, no one spoke. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence you sometimes feel in a quiet room. This silence was heavy, awkward, and spreading slowly from one corner of the conference table to the other. It felt like the entire room was trying to process what I had just said. My cousin Brandon was the first to react. He let out a short laugh, the kind people make when they assume someone is joking. "Okay, that was a good one," he said, shaking his head. "You almost had us there." A few people chuckled again, though much more quietly this time. But the laughter didn't last long. I didn't laugh with them. Instead, I simply sat there, relaxed in my chair, my hands folded lightly on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to explain right away. I just looked at them, and that made the silence grow even deeper. Across the table, Aunt Caroline narrowed her eyes at me. She had always been the type of person who believed she could read people instantly. She leaned forward slightly. "Amelia," she said slowly, "you're joking, right?" I tilted my head slightly. "No," I replied calmly. That was when the atmosphere in the room shifted. You could almost feel the change in the air. Someone set their coffee cup down a little too quickly. A chair creaked as one of my cousins leaned forward. Brandon stopped smiling completely now. He stared at me for a few seconds. "Wait," he said, frowning. "What do you mean you own the building?" I glanced briefly at my phone screen on the table, then back up at them. "The apartment complex," I said. "The one this conference room is in?" Still silence. Then Brandon scoffed. "That building belongs to a property management company," he said confidently. "Everybody knows that." Aunt Caroline nodded quickly. "Yes, exactly," she added. "The invoices all come from some company called—" She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes flicked toward the screen of her phone as if a thought had suddenly appeared in her mind. I watched the realization begin to form. I spoke before she finished her sentence. "Avery Urban Holdings," I said. Now several heads turned. My cousin Laura blinked. "Wait," she said slowly. "How do you know that?" I kept my tone steady because it's my company. No one laughed this time. Instead, the room filled with the quiet sounds of people unlocking their phones. You could hear the soft taps of fingers on screens as they searched emails, checked rent invoices, and scrolled through payment confirmations. Brandon pulled out his phone too. His eyebrows slowly began to pull together as he looked down at something on the screen. A few seconds passed, then he looked up at me again. This says the new property owner took over 3 months ago," he said. I nodded slightly. "That's right." Across the table, Aunt Caroline was still staring at her phone. Her voice sounded very different when she finally spoke again. "Amelia, this company address, it's registered downtown." "Yes. And the owner name?" She stopped talking. Slowly, she lifted her eyes from the screen and looked directly at me. "Amelia Carter." No one said anything for several seconds. My Uncle Derek, the same man who had been laughing just minutes earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That can't be right," he muttered. But the more they checked their phones, the more the truth spread around the table. One by one, the whispers started. "Wait, I see it too. Is this real? When did this happen?" Several of them lived in the building. Several more rented offices inside the complex. And now they were all realizing something at the exact same time. Their landlord was sitting right across the table. I leaned back slightly in my chair and watched the expressions change around the room. Got confusion, disbelief, a little bit of panic. But inside my mind, something else was happening, because while they were all staring at their screens, I was remembering something very different. I was remembering the years when they didn't think I would ever succeed, the years when every family gathering felt exactly like this one, except back then, I was the one sitting quietly while everyone else laughed. That memory slowly pulled me backward, back to where the story really began, back to the time when, in their eyes, I was nothing more than the failure of the family, and that was when the real story started. As everyone in the conference room stared at their phones in stunned silence, my mind drifted back years earlier, long before anyone had heard of Avery Urban Holdings, long before I owned anything at all than my family. Success had always been a very public thing. It was something you talked about loudly at dinner tables, something you displayed through expensive watches, large houses, and impressive job titles. My relatives loved numbers, but not the quiet kind. They loved the numbers that sounded impressive when spoken out loud. Salary numbers, investment numbers, real estate numbers. And in that environment, I was always the quiet one. I grew up in a large, extended American family where gatherings were frequent and competitive in subtle ways. Every holiday dinner eventually turned into a comparison of achievements. My cousin Brandon graduated from a prestigious finance program and immediately landed a job at an investment firm in Chicago. Everyone talked about his bonuses. My cousin Laura became a lawyer before she turned 30. At family dinners, people proudly mentioned the firm she worked for. Then there was me. Whenever my name came up, the conversations became vague. Amelia works with numbers. Someone would say she's in analytics. I think another relative might add, even as a kid, I noticed the difference. When Brandon talked about his ambitions, people leaned forward and listened. When Laura discussed law school, everyone praised her determination. But when I talked about what interested me, people didn't really understand it. I liked numbers too, but not the glamorous kind. I liked spreadsheets, market trends, quiet patterns hidden inside financial data. I enjoyed studying why certain neighborhoods suddenly increased in value, or why some properties stayed undervalued for years before rising dramatically. But those interests didn't sound impressive during holiday dinners. They sounded boring over time. My relatives began forming a simple assumption about me. Amelia lacked ambition. They didn't say it directly at first. It started with small comments. You're still figuring things out. Someone would say kindly, or you'll find your direction eventually. But as the years passed, the comments became less subtle. One Thanksgiving dinner still stayed. Clear in my memory, the entire extended family had gathered at my grandparents' house. The table was crowded with food and conversation. People were talking about investments, promotions, and real estate deals. My uncle Derek leaned back in his chair while Brandon described a new financial opportunity his company was exploring. That's the kind of thinking that builds wealth, Uncle, Derek said proudly. Then he looked around the table, and that's the difference between people who lead and people who just drift. The room grew quiet for a moment, and slowly, several people glanced toward me. No one said my name, but everyone knew exactly what he meant. I remember lowering my eyes to my plate, pretending to focus on the food. Inside, something burned quietly in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like determination that night. After the dinner ended and everyone had gone home, I lay awake in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling. The words repeated in my mind. People who lead and people who drift. Maybe my family couldn't see it. Maybe they thought I lacked direction, but they were wrong. Did have a plan. I just wasn't the type of person who talked about plans before they worked. That night, I made a silent decision one day. I would prove them wrong, not by arguing, not by bragging, but by building something real, something they would never expect. And the first step toward that future began shortly after I graduated from college. When reality hit harder than I had imagined after college, reality arrived much faster than confidence. I graduated with a degree in economics and a long list of student loans that suddenly felt very real the moment the grace period ended. My first job was an entry-level analyst position at a small financial consulting firm in Boston. It sounded respectable when I told people about it, but the reality was far less glamorous. My salary was modest. After taxes, rent, loan payments, and basic living expenses, there wasn't much left at the end of each month. Meanwhile, my cousins seemed to be moving ahead at full speed. Brandon was already talking about investment, portfolios, and bonuses that sounded larger than my entire yearly income. Laura was posting pictures online from business, conferences, and celebrating promotions at her law firm. Every time the family gathered, the comparisons returned. So how's work going, Amelia? Someone would ask politely. Still doing analytics? Another relative would say, they never asked about my plans. They assumed there weren't any. Sometimes I overheard conversations that weren't meant for me. She's smart, one aunt once said quietly to another, but she just doesn't seem ambitious. I didn't argue. Instead, I focused on something most of them didn't notice. Patterns. Every evening after work, I would return to my small rented studio apartment. It wasn't much, just a single room with a small kitchen and a desk pushed against the wall, but it became my classroom. Night after night, I studied. I analyzed housing market data. I read reports about commercial real estate cycles. I followed trends in rental demand across different cities. The more I looked at the numbers, the more something interesting started to appear. There were buildings, entire apartment complexes that were significantly undervalued, not because the locations were bad, not because the demand was low, but because they were poorly managed owners, neglected maintenance, mismanaged tenant relationships, or simply lacked the systems needed to operate efficiently. As a result, these properties generated less income than they should have, and because of that, their market values stayed low. But the underlying demand for housing in those areas was still strong, which meant something important. If someone bought those properties and managed them correctly, the value could increase dramatically at first. It was just a theory I explored in spreadsheets. I compared property values, rental prices, and maintenance costs across dozens of neighborhoods. I studied foreclosure listings, distressed property reports, and municipal housing records. The numbers kept pointing to the same conclusion. Opportunity existed where most people weren't looking. Many investors were chasing luxury developments and high-profile projects, but older apartment buildings, especially small to mid-sized ones, were often ignored. To my relatives, success looked loud and expensive to me. Success looked like a quiet spreadsheet filled with potential, but knowing the opportunity existed and actually acting on it were two very different things, because there was one obvious problem. Buying property required money, and at that point in my life, I barely had any. My savings were small, my salary was limited, and the idea of purchasing real estate seemed completely out of reach for someone in my situation. Still, I kept studying. For months, I ran numbers late into the night, analyzing property listings and market data. Most of the time, the deals didn't make sense, but one night, while scrolling through a list of distressed properties in a neighborhood just outside the city center, I saw something that made me stop. It was a small apartment, building 8 units. The price was unusually low at first glance. It looked like another struggling property with maintenance issues and inconsistent rent payments. But when I examined the details more closely, I saw something others might have missed. The location was improving. New businesses were moving into the area. Public transportation access had recently expanded. Rental demand was slowly rising. The building itself wasn't beyond repair. It just needed attention, better management, better systems, better decisions. For the first time, the opportunity I had been studying on spreadsheets suddenly became real. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. My heart started beating faster, because I realized something. If the numbers were correct, this property could work, but it would require a risk, a very big one. And the moment I began seriously considering that risk was the moment my life quietly started changing, because the next step I took would be the first real move toward everything that came later. The listing for that small apartment building stayed on my screen long after midnight. 8 units, an aging structure, peeling paint in the photos, a property description that sounded almost apologetic. Most investors probably scrolled past it without thinking twice, but I kept looking at the numbers. The purchase price was unusually low for the area. The current rents were also low, which explained why the property seemed unattractive to experienced buyers. The previous owner had clearly stopped investing effort into the building years earlier, but when I calculated the potential rental income after reasonable renovations and proper management, the math changed completely. The property wasn't worthless. It was simply neglected. That difference mattered for the next week. I spent every evening analyzing every detail I could find. I reviewed neighborhood data, property tax records, nearby rental prices, and historical housing trends. The more I studied it, the more confident I became. The building had potential, but confidence alone doesn't buy property. Money does. At that point, my savings account contained just under $28,000 for most people. That might sound like a respectable amount of savings for real estate investing. It was almost nothing. I knew the traditional path: large down payment, strong credit history, and a lender willing to approve a mortgage. But I also knew something else. If I waited until everything was comfortable and safe, the opportunity would disappear one evening. I called the number listed on the property advertisement. The agent sounded tired when she answered. "Hi," I said. "I'm calling about the 8-unit building on Lincoln Street." There was a short pause. "Oh," she said. "That one." Her tone suggested she had answered that question many times. "Are you an investor?" she asked. "Yes." "Well," she sighed lightly, "the property needs work. Most buyers walk away after the first inspection. I'd still like to see it." 2 days later, I stood on the sidewalk in front of the building for the first time. It looked exactly like the listing. Photos, maybe even a little worse. The brick exterior was faded. The entrance door needed repair. Some windows looked older than the rest, but the structure itself felt solid. Inside, the hallways were worn but functional. Several units were occupied. A few tenants glanced curiously at me as I walked through the building with the agent. "This place has had management problems for years," she explained as we moved through the corridor. "Late maintenance, poor tenant communication. The owner stopped responding to complaints." I nodded slowly. Those problems didn't scare me. They confirmed what my research had already suggested, that the building wasn't failing because the location was bad. It was failing because the management was bad. Outside, I stood for a moment looking up at the structure. 8 units, 8 families living there, 8 monthly rent payments. My mind quietly ran the numbers again. If rents were gradually adjusted to match the neighborhood average, if repairs were handled properly, if tenants were treated with respect, the building could become profitable, but only if I took the risk. That night, I called my bank. The loan officer sounded skeptical. "You're 26, he said carefully. "You have limited capital and no property ownership history." "I understand. And this is a distressed multi-unit property?" "Yes." There was a pause, then he said something that didn't surprise me. "This would be considered a high-risk loan." He wasn't wrong from the outside. It looked like a bad idea. A young analyst with limited savings trying to purchase an aging apartment building. But I had something. Most people in the conversation didn't. I had the numbers, and the numbers told a different story. After several meetings, paperwork, and long conversations with lenders, I finally secured a small investment loan, barely enough to make the deal possible. The day I signed the purchase documents, my hands felt slightly unsteady. Not from fear exactly, from the weight of responsibility, because in that moment, everything changed. I was no longer studying opportunities and spreadsheets. I owned 1.8 units, one aging building, and a future that depended entirely on whether my plan would work. What I didn't know yet was how difficult the next 2 years would become, because buying the building turned out to be the easiest part of the entire journey. Owning the building felt exciting. For exactly one day, the next morning, reality arrived. My phone started ringing before I even finished my coffee. One tenant reported a leaking pipe in the bathroom. Another complained about a broken heater. Someone else wanted to talk about a window that wouldn't close properly. Within the first week, I realized just how neglected the building had been before I bought it. The previous owner hadn't been exaggerating about the management problems. But strangely, none of this discouraged me. It confirmed my original theory. The building wasn't a lost cause. It simply needed attention, and that's what I gave it. Every day after finishing my job at the consulting firm, I went straight to the property. I spent evenings walking through hallways, meeting tenants, and writing down repair lists at first. Some residents were suspicious. They weren't used to seeing the owner in person. One elderly tenant named Mr. Harris looked surprised when I knocked on his door during my first week. "You're the new landlord?" he asked. "Yes. You look younger than the last one." I smiled slightly. That might be an advantage. Instead of raising rents immediately, I focused on fixing the basics first. The plumbing system needed repairs. Several electrical outlets had to be replaced. The entrance lighting was improved. I hired a small local maintenance crew and started addressing problems that had been ignored for years. The work took time and money. Many nights I returned to my apartment exhausted, wondering if I had underestimated the difficulty of the project. My savings were shrinking quickly, but something interesting began happening after a few months. The building started changing. Tenants who had been planning to leave decided to stay. Small improvements, working lights, quick repairs, better communication made a bigger difference than I expected. People began treating the building differently when they realized someone actually cared about maintaining it. One evening, Mr. Harris stopped me in the hallway. "You know," he said, leaning on his cane, "I've lived here 11 years. First time I've seen management respond to a problem the same week." I thanked him, but inside I was quietly encouraged. 6 months later, the building looked noticeably better. The exterior had been cleaned. Hallway lights worked properly. Maintenance requests were handled quickly. Only, after those improvements, did I begin making gradual adjustments to the rent. Nothing extreme, just bringing the prices closer to the neighborhood average because the building was now better maintained. Most tenants understood the changes. Occupancy stayed high. Cash flow slowly improved for the first time. The spreadsheets I had studied for so long began turning into reality. But the most important change wasn't financial, it was strategic. Because as the building became stable, the bank began seeing me differently. The same loan officer, who had once called the investment high risk, scheduled a meeting with me about 18 months later. He studied the updated financial statements carefully. "Your occupancy rate is impressive," he said, "and the property value has increased." I replied. He nodded slowly. "Yes, it has." Then he leaned back in his chair. "Have you considered acquiring additional properties?" That question stayed with me for weeks, because until that moment, I had been focused only on making the first building succeed. But now, something larger became possible. If one neglected property could be improved through better management, what about 2 or 3? That was when the idea for Avery Urban Holdings quietly formed. Not a loud company, not a flashy brand, just a simple real estate business, focused on identifying undervalued apartment buildings and managing them well over the next few years. I reinvested nearly every dollar the first property produced. Slowly, carefully, I began purchasing additional small buildings. 10 units here, 12 units there, nothing that attracted attention. Nothing impressive enough to discuss at family dinners, but each property followed the same pattern: buy undervalued, improve. Management. Increase stability. Reinvest the profits. And eventually, the portfolio grew large enough that a much bigger opportunity appeared. An opportunity involving a property that felt strangely familiar. A mid-sized apartment complex. In a city where several members of my own family happened to live. The same building where our annual family conference was scheduled that year. At the time, none of them knew I was the buyer, and honestly, I didn't feel any need to tell them until the moment they laughed at me in that conference room, and suddenly, the truth became impossible to keep quiet. The memory faded, and my attention slowly returned to the conference room. Everyone was still sitting around the long table, phones in their hands, eyes moving between their screens and my face. The silence felt very different now. Earlier, it had been the comfortable kind of laughter that came from believing someone else was beneath you. Now it was uncertainty. My cousin Brandon cleared his throat. "So, you're saying," he began, slowly, "that your company bought this entire building?" "Yes," I said calmly. "And the apartment complex across the street, too?" Laura asked quietly, still looking at her phone. Double quotes. "Yes." Another silence followed. This one felt heavier. Uncle Derek leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "But when did this happen?" He asked. "About 3 months ago, and none of us knew." I gave a small shrug. "No one asked." That answer hung in the air, longer than I expected, because the truth was simple. They had never asked what I was building. They had only assumed I wasn't building anything at all. Aunt Caroline set her phone down slowly on the table. "You're telling me," she said carefully, "that all this time you've been running a property company?" "Yes." "How many buildings do you own?" For the first time since the conversation started, several people leaned forward at the same time. They were curious now, not amused, not dismissive, curious. I paused for a moment before answering. 7. I said. The number moved through the room like a quiet shockwave. Brandon blinked. 7 buildings. Small to mid-sized residential properties, I explained. Nothing flashy, but this complex alone has over 60 units, Laura said, staring at her screen. That's right. Across the table, someone whispered softly. Wait, that means... They were doing the math now. Monthly rent multiplied by dozens of tenants, operating income, property value. Numbers that suddenly sounded very different from the version of me they had imagined. Uncle Derek shifted in his chair. Again, that his earlier confidence had disappeared. Well, he said slowly, that's impressive. The word sounded unfamiliar coming from him. A few months earlier, he had laughed while saying I couldn't even afford a house. Now he was sitting inside a building I owned. But the strangest part was that I didn't feel angry. For years, I had imagined what this moment might feel like. I thought I would enjoy proving them wrong. I thought there would be satisfaction, but instead, I mostly felt calm because the success itself had never really been about them. It had been about the quiet promise I made to myself years ago at that Thanksgiving dinner, back when people talked about leaders and drifters. Brandon finally broke the silence again. So, when you said earlier you owned the building, he said slowly, you weren't exaggerating, no. And technically, Laura added, glancing around the room, several of us are renting from you right now. I smiled slightly. Yes, technically. For a moment, the entire table seemed unsure how to react then. Mr. Harris's voice echoed in my memory, the tenant who once said he had never seen management respond so quickly to problems that had always been the real goal, not to impress my relatives, but to build something stable and useful finally. Aunt Caroline exhaled softly. Well, she said, folding her hands together, I suppose this family conference just became much more interesting. A few quiet laughs followed. This time, the laughter sounded different, not mocking, just surprised. And for the first time during the entire evening, the conversation around the table began shifting from assumptions about my life to genuine questions about how I had built it. The conversation in the conference room slowly changed after that. Instead of jokes, people started asking questions, real questions. How did you start? Brandon asked. What made you choose those properties? Laura added. Even Uncle Derek seemed more thoughtful now. I answered them honestly, explaining the long nights studying spreadsheets, the first small building, the repairs, the risks, and the slow process of reinvesting profits. There had been no shortcuts, no dramatic breakthroughs, just quiet decisions repeated over many years. For a long time, my family had believed success needed to look loud, to be real, big announcements, expensive displays, constant proof. But my journey had looked very different. It happened quietly. While people assumed I was drifting, I was studying while others talked about opportunities. I was building systems while the world chased attention. I focused on patience. Owning the building where we sat wasn't a moment of revenge. It was simply the result of years of consistent work that no one had been watching. Eventually, the conference ended. People gathered their things and slowly walked out of the room. Some looked thoughtful. Some looked impressed. A few still looked slightly shocked. As I stepped outside the building that evening, the air felt cool and calm. Tenants moved in and out of the lobby. Lights glowed in dozens of apartment windows above. A few years earlier, I had been a young analyst sitting in a tiny apartment studying numbers late at night. Now I stood in front of something real, something built one decision at a time, and the lesson I learned from the entire journey was simple. Never confuse silence with failure. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is simply busy building something that doesn't need to be announced. Now, I'm curious about you. Have you ever been underestimated by people around you? What happened in the end? Share your story in the comments. I read them all. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder that success doesn't always make noise. Thank you for watching. And wherever you are in the world today, I wish you patience, courage, and the confidence to keep building your own path.